I'll give up for Vice Lord. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So this is an event for the Libertarian presidential candidate Bob Barr. You might be wondering what the Green Party congressional candidate is doing here. Well, I'll tell you. There's a lot in common between not just the Libertarians and the Greens, but the third parties in general. And as a case in point, a lot of you know about Ron Paul's run for the White House. And he's really a hometown hero. He's from Pittsburgh. Ron Paul ran as a Republican, but then he didn't go to the Republican convention and endorse the party ticket. He held his own convention. And then he also got an agreement between the four main third-party candidates. So he reached an agreement, a written agreement that was signed by Ralph Nader, Green Party candidate Cynthia McKinney, Libertarian candidate Bob Barr, and Constitution Party candidate Chuck Baldwin. And this is an agreement I enthusiastically endorse. You know, we've been imposed, this left-right, liberal-conservative dichotomy has been imposed on us, and it's become increasingly meaningless, because we can look at McCain and we can look at Obama, and they're both for militaristic foreign policy war. The only difference is maybe McCain wants more fighting in Iraq, and Obama wants to fight more in Afghanistan, but they both want to have this giant archipelago of military bases. They both want to increase the military budget. They both want the bailout. Have you heard either of them talk about the encroachments on our constitutional liberties? No, and you won't hear it. This is the agreement that the third-party candidates struck with Ron Paul. On foreign policy, the Iraq war must end as quickly as possible with the removal of all our soldiers from the region. We must initiate the return of our soldiers from around the world, including Japan, Korea, and Europe, and the entire Middle East. We must cease the war propaganda, the threats of a blockade, and plans for attack on Iran. Nor should we reignite the Cold War with Russia over Georgia. We must be willing to talk to all countries and offer friendship and trade and travel to all who are willing. We must take off the table the threat of a nuclear first strike against all nations. You're not going to hear Democrats or Republicans talking about that. All the third-party candidates have agreed on that. On privacy, we must protect the privacy and civil liberties of all persons under U.S. jurisdiction. We must repeal or radically change the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the FISA legislation. We must reject the notion and practice of torture, eliminations of habeas corpus, secret tribunals, and secret prisons. We must deny immunity for corporations that spy willingly on the people for the benefit of the government. We must reject the unitary presidency and the illegal use of signing statements and excessive use of executive orders. This was agreed by all the main third-party candidates. On the national debt, we believe that there should be no increase in the national debt. The burden of debt placed on the next generation is unjust and already threatening our economy and the value of our dollar. We must pay our bills and go along, as we go along, and not unfairly place this burden on future generations. And if I may inject here, you see both Obama and McCain supporting this bailout, really giveaway to Wall Street. And it's a giveaway. It doesn't fix the problem, and Wall Street knows it doesn't fix the problem, which is why you continue to have a nosedive. It doesn't address the problem of excessive deregulation, of foreclosures on properties. And then finally, and this is key, this is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but the third-party candidates are agreed on this. The Federal Reserve. We seek a thorough investigation, evaluation, and audit of the Federal Reserve System and its cozy relations with banking, corporate, and other financial institutions. There you go. The arbitrary power to create money out of thin air, behind closed doors, and for the benefit of commercial interests must be ended. There should be no taxpayer bailouts of corporations and no corporate subsidies. And this was signed before this bailout agreement was even talked about. So the third-party candidates are ahead of the curve on this. Corporations should be aggressively prosecuted for their crimes and frauds. And I just want to finish up getting back to the bailout. Congressman Doyle voted for the bailout. Both times it was voted on by the House of Representatives. When he explained his vote, he said nothing was not an option. We had to do something. Well, let me tell you, something includes a lot more than simply handing a blank check to Henry Paulson to distribute to his friends on Wall Street. There's a lot more to something than that. I'm not a congressman yet, but I wrote a plan based on my 20 years working in the financial markets and my experience watching the Japanese financial meltdown and its subsequent trials and errors, getting a lot of things wrong and some things right. And I have a plan. I'm not going to read the whole plan, but it's on my website, votenorth.org. It starts with a thorough audit of the banks, and it ends with a complete reimbursement of taxpayers for any money that gets spent. It's completely based on market relationships between the government and the financial institutions in any transaction.
My name is Dave Powell. I'm the chairman for the Libertarian Party of Allegheny County, and I'd like to introduce David Posapanka here. He's running for Pennsylvania Assembly, 35th District, against Mark Gergley. And give it up for Dave Posapanka.
Thank you very much.
Stay there.
We don't have a lot of time, so I'd just like to dive into a couple issues. And one of the things I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, especially if you're an Allegheny County resident, one of the things that Dan Honorado and the local Democrats here want to do is they tell us they want to bail out Port Authority Transit with either the drink tax or the property tax. We already have a 2% tax if you need a car rental, and that goes to subsidize a multi-million-dollar company, Port Authority Transit. They presented to the people that, well, we're going to get you one way or another. We're either going to tax your property, or we're going to tax you when you go into an establishment to enjoy yourself for a pour drink. One way or another, you're going to get taxed. That's been the message of the Democrats, and I'm running against an incumbent Democrat. If you take a look at other corporate welfare policies, well, Governor Rendell has given away millions of dollars to companies to bail out companies. Once again, it's corporate welfare. Libertarian Party doesn't believe in corporate welfare at all. We would like to end that. Mr. North talked about the bailout. Libertarian Party would hold the CEOs of these companies that made the bad decisions personally liable for that. You like that idea? Not one penny of tax dollars that would go to that corporate bailout. Why should we have to pay for somebody else's mistake? And it's forced on us by force. It's legislated. Former President Bill Clinton said once in a executive order, wow, stroke of the pen, law of the land. It's pretty easy. Yeah, it's pretty easy, and it's pretty liberal when you take somebody else's money. I'm a drug and alcohol counselor by trade. I've been working since 1983, 2 jobs to make ends meet. I'm a taxpayer here in Pennsylvania. I work with a lot of addictions. I think Harrisburg is addicted to OPM, other people's money. And I'd like to use my counseling skills to be able to change a little bit of that. And I would need your support for that. If you live in the Mon Valley, anywhere from White Oak to Homestead, I would appreciate your vote, and possibly even your time, to help put out some pamphlets. We're building a tunnel. We need a tunnel in Pittsburgh for Port Authority. Guess who's paying for that? You know, we still owe money for Three Rivers Stadium. Thank you, Dan Honorado. Let's build another stadium. Let's do a Tiddlywink Stadium then, too. Why don't we? We're going to be building a Penguin Stadium, and we're going to be paying that. The Rat Pats in Pennsylvania is one of the things that I would like to see Harrisburg change. In Allegheny County, we're paying an extra 1% sales tax to subsidize, once again, $1 million companies. You like to subsidize millionaires? You work 2 jobs too? You having trouble? One of the things that I would also like to propose, Mr. North touched on that a little bit. What you see standing here, I'm considered a second-class citizen. You know that? Because in Pennsylvania, we have a 2-tiered system. We have what's called a major party and a minor party. And if you are not a Democrat or a Republican, you have to fight and get extra signatures on your petition, a lot extra signatures, in order just to have a chance to run. We think that that's fundamentally wrong. We think that your voice is silenced like that. I'd like to see that change by an equal access, an equal ballot access law. Instead of having major parties and minor parties, just plain and simple party. Do you think that is fair? Both of the major parties like to talk about fairness. Well, let's step up to the plate then, and let's see it. None of them would sponsor that. So I ask you, why is Pennsylvania, the whole federal government, invested in just keeping it to 2 parties? Have you watched the presidential debates at all? Did you fall asleep the other day? Okay.
On Saturday Night Live.
Why wasn't people like Ralph Nader or Bob Barr invited to that? They're presidential candidates too. Okay? The media, once again, it's the media. They like to exclude everybody else. I thought that, and both parties like to talk about being your parties of tolerance. Why are they intolerant toward me or Mr. North? Just a thought. Speaking about fairness, what do you think about the casino? Once again, they talk about wanting to be fair. Once again, our tax dollars are going to go to subsidize multi-billion-dollar industry, casinos. Have you ever been to a mom and pop pizza shop or a bar where they have a little poker machine in there? Why not? The Democrats especially like to talk about being good to the little guy. Well, why don't you give them a license and let them have that first, and let them have a license to operate their own poker machine? What do you think? Is that a good idea? They say that they're for the little guy, but once again, what do? They forcibly take from one American to subsidize a multi-billion-dollar industry. We think that's fundamentally wrong.
Good.
All right, once again, that was David Placepanka, 35th District, Pennsylvania.
Briefly plug an issue of local and nationwide interest. In this election, about 30 to 40% of voters are going to cast their votes on a paperless electronic voting machine. And all of the paperless electronic voting machines in Pennsylvania have the interesting property that whether they work or not, whether the votes are accurate or not, depends totally on whether the software in them is right or not. And for none of the thousands of machines in this state has anyone checked. So if that's a little surprising, then please read up a little bit on the issue. Their orange pamphlets will be outside. You can look at the website voteallegheny.org. This is one of these strange but true things.
Okay, so thank you all for coming out. I know you all must be busy. The subject of this lecture series is political leadership. Like many people here, I got very active in politics with the Ron Paul campaign. I'll just say right up front that I can think of no other current leader in Congress other than Ron Paul that has any kind of credibility whatsoever. I would also say this lack of credibility extends to Senators Obama and McCain. I might have been able to vote for the Obama of 2005, but he voted for the MCA, Military Commissions Act, FISA bill, and to extend the funding for the illegal Iraq War. So, no hope or change for me then. I went to CampaignForLiberty.com's Rally for the Republic in September, which was a really great event. No tear gas like the GOP rally, but you know, fun nonetheless. The cops did bring their gas masks later in the afternoon, but you know, the mood was just gone. I heard this at the rally, so I can't claim authorship of this, but it's one of the truest things I've heard in years. Sometimes it seems that we have a choice between the evil party and the stupid party. As they enact laws that are either evil or stupid. Sometimes, though, we get laws that are evil and stupid. We call this bipartisanship. And so it is with the great Wall Street bailout. You know, if I could go back in time 10 years and ask myself what I thought of mortgage-backed securities, credit default swaps, habeas corpus, RFID chips, and waterboarding, I probably would have returned a fairly hostile stare and said, well, what the hell is all that? Stay away from me, you weirdo. So I must ask, do we want to be activists? Do we want to be hanging out flyers at midnight? Do we want to be answering emails at 3 a.m.? Do I want to be here in this hot suit talking about politics and arcane constitutional and financial matters? No. We have a lot of things we'd rather be doing. We have families, hobbies, and some really good TV to watch. By the way, My Name is Earl just started up. I don't know if you like that, but that's one of my favorite shows. For some reason, we are all here. Why is that? Why is that? Because we have to be. We have to be activists. We have to fight for change, real change. I'm here today because the government has taken away your rights to habeas corpus. I'm here because waterboarding is something that your tax dollars pay for. I'm here because this deficit spending is nothing more than stealing from our children and our grandchildren. You know, the New York City debt clock was not big enough anymore. They had to upgrade it and add another decimal on it. I'm here because the Constitution is the framework that makes this country great, and our government has been ignoring it for far too long. If the government does not follow the law, then there is no law. It is a government of men, with all their shortcomings, faults, and weaknesses. So if I may take a moment, if you'll indulge me, to address a financial crisis. You cannot fix a leaky dam with more water. You cannot fix a debt problem with more debt. It's as simple as that. You cannot prop up failing businesses with tax dollars. We in this area, the Pittsburgh area, know this firsthand, but they don't seem to know it yet in D.C. And make no mistake, when they talk about credit, they mean debt. Failed institutions must be liquidated so that the good stuff that's left can be bought up by people who save and return to productivity as soon as possible. Any money spent to the contrary will just delay the inevitable. Look at AIG. We give them $80 billion, and after they throw themselves a $500,000 party, they come back with $37 billion more. They authorized $700 billion to hold off the stock market collapse. And what did we get? What's that called again? Oh yeah, stock market collapse. Even the socialist independent Bernie Sanders voted against the bailout. The socialists voted against the bailout. Think about that. Now what we really have to avoid here is a currency collapse. As the late great Mr. Rogers would say, can you say hyperinflationary depression, kids? Sure, I knew you could. In case you're unfamiliar, a currency collapse is when your country needs to sell a lot of goods or currency or debt and no one will buy it. Or if they need to borrow a lot of money, nobody will lend it. So the central bank prints money and the currency buys less and less the more it prints. If other countries stop lending us $2 billion a day, our government will be forced to cut Social Security, Medicare, and military spending in half very quickly. Then, instead of just the stock market people going broke, through currency inflation, everyone goes broke. This is why we must end the Fed. I stand here today to say to all who will listen, your republic is on the edge. This Democratic Congress has not had the will to stand up to a corrupt administration, preferring instead to lapdog themselves into better standing the next round of handouts. The fact that Bob Barr and the other third-party candidates were excluded from the presidential debates just shows that it was just a big joint press conference under the guise of open debate held on your tax dollar. We need people to take a stand. We need people to run for local office. And we have a few here tonight. You saw David Posapanka, Titus North, and another fellow, Jim Barr, are all running for local office. And we applaud them for that. up against the corrupt beltway politics that are bleeding our country dry. Folks, we have here tonight such a man. He's a former federal prosecutor and former member of the United States House of Representatives. He represented Georgia's 7th Congressional District as a Republican from 1995 to 2003. Bob joined the Libertarian Party in 2006 and served on its national committee. We are all human, and therefore imperfect. Like Earl Hickey on the My Name is Earl TV show, Bob Barr has made some decisions in the past that many of us don't agree with 100%. But like Earl Hickey, he means to make amends, no matter what it takes. And he stands with you today as a flag bearer of the liberty movement, champion of the Constitution, and a crusader for your personal freedoms. He is willing to sacrifice, to stand for office. He is ready to lead. He is our candidate for the office of President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Barr.
Is the sound okay with the lapel pin?
Yes.
Good, thank you. My name is Bob Barr, and I'm running for President of the United States. Now, I repeat that because some of the qualifications for President seem to be prevalent both among the media and a lot of the pundits. I don't subscribe to. You might have noticed I'm not wearing a flag lapel pin. I also have only one house, and more important than that, I don't care how many houses the other candidates have. That lack of curiosity and lack of concern for how many houses these other candidates have would disqualify me from serving as president. I also happen to probably over the course of my 59 years have had coffee with a number of people of dubious background. That apparently also would disqualify me from serving as president in the eyes of some of the other major parties and some of the other candidates. Most importantly, though, I am not afraid to operate outside of my comfort zone, which, according to the Republican and Democrat parties, also would disqualify somebody from serving as president. So all of those things I bring to your attention because we are involved in a presidential race for which I dare say the future of liberty in America depends absolutely not one whit on who wears a flag lapel pin, how many houses candidates have, who they might have had coffee with 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years ago, and whether or not they operate outside their comfort zone. The last point, though, is very important. I found it quite interesting that in these recent so-called debates, and I think one really has to add that qualifier that they are so-called debates because they are not debates in any sense that those of us who have been involved in true academic discourse and who have been involved in true politics, you know, to us a debate is a real exchange of ideas. A debate by definition is pulling one outside of their comfort zone, not ensuring that they remain encased in their comfort zone. Yet the candidates for the Republican and Democrat parties, they spend, of course, countless hours, their staffs and their handlers and so forth, they spend countless hours, even before the debates, setting up rules for the debates themselves to assure that they are not taken outside their comfort zone, that they remain inside their comfort zone. And the Republican vice presidential candidate, just a few days ago during the vice presidential debate, as it were, not only had assured herself that the parameters of the debate and the selection of the moderator, I think there was a moderator there at many points in the debate. It appeared that there wasn't, but even notwithstanding the fact that they set up these rules and regulations and parameters of the debate, so neither candidate might be pulled outside of their comfort zone for a short period of time. That wasn't good enough for Governor Palin. She said quite clearly, I am not going to go outside of my comfort zone. Even if you ask questions that are designed to, and that you would like to have me be pulled outside of my comfort zone, I'm not going to do it. And the surprising thing was, of course, there was great applause among those not in the auditorium. I'm not sure if they were awake, but outside of that, apparently among the party faithful for the Republican Party, and the moderator, true to form, just sat there. So the distressing thing, I mean, comical as it might be to watch these things, the distressing thing is these are men and women who are vying to serve in a very serious office. There is not on the face of the earth, at least in a political sense, a more serious office than the President of the United States. And somebody seeking to be elected not just to that office, but to the vice presidency, and that person should be absolutely in every way, shape, and form qualified also to serve as president. This is a job that by definition, every moment of which will take place outside of their comfort zone. And we, therefore, the people of this country, need to assure ourselves with at least some passing degree of certainty that whoever we are going to elect to that job of President of the United States has at least some ability to operate outside of their comfort zone. I really don't care how well Senator Biden or Governor Palin or Senator Obama or Senator McCain can operate answering questions that they want to be asked. I mean, that is not what they're going to be called on to do as President of the United States. We've seen with very tragic long-term consequences, for example, the election of a president, the currently serving president, who, similar to Sarah Palin, did not really have any experience in operating in the real world outside of the borders of our country, and then who sat down with, as a president must do, to sit down with foreign leaders that operate entirely outside of our comfort zone, adversarial leaders from cultures, environments, and with history very vastly different from our own. We saw very quickly the problems where a president who has not, during the campaign, been forced to operate outside of his comfort zone, then to be sort of plugged down in the middle of the world arena and to sit down across, for example, from a Vladimir Putin who is deeply trained and immersed in operating outside of his comfort zone. The president, in his naive way, then looks into Mr. Putin's and sees something that he believes represents a simpatico relationship, and that then colors quite problematically for many years to come our relationship in view of how to deal with Russia. That is the former, by and large, the former Soviet Union. And yet what we have through this process, this modern process of selecting presidents and vice presidents, which is essentially the same thing, or should be viewed as the same thing, is a series of discussions and a series of sound bites, a series of get-togethers that pass for debates, and yet which are designed to show us not one single thing about how these people will operate as president. And I guess that really shouldn't bother us, really. It shouldn't surprise us. It certainly should bother us, but it shouldn't surprise us because, after all, this is simply a continuation or reflective of the entire modern system of politics in America, dictated by and large by the two-party system, the two-party monopoly that we have, where both of the two major parties are simply two sides of the same coin of the realm, which is the status quo. We have a system that has developed and in which we have a huge crop of leaders, but no leadership. I mean, we have all sorts of folks up there who are leading the charge. We have Mr. Hank Paulson, and seeking to become, and may very well now by virtue of this legislation that the House and the Senate passed within the last week or so, and which has been signed by a president never at a loss to be predisposed to sign legislation increasing federal power. We now have the Secretary of the Treasury who heads an oversight board supposed to oversee what he's doing, who has absolute authority, or as close under our system of government as you can get to absolute authority to expend upwards of in excess of $700 billion with virtually no oversight. Now, I guess we are supposed to feel somewhat good about that because the original legislation, that three-page piece of legislation that was submitted to the Congress about 2 weeks ago, crafted apparently by Mr. Paulson himself, was a little bit different, at least on the surface. First of all, instead of the 450 pages that the Senate wound up passing and that the House then reversed itself and passed, apparently concluding that a 450-page piece of legislation with an additional $150 billion of sweetener was much more responsible than the 150-page piece of, or 110-page piece of legislation that they had refused to pass 4 days earlier without all of those $150 billion worth of sweeteners. But this new piece of legislation that is now law, by the way, does include an oversight board. So the Secretary of the Treasury has to get his permission before he can indeed expend upwards of, or in excess of, $700 billion. But this process of meeting the financial crisis that is facing America really illustrates aptly the lack of attention or lack of emphasis that we place in this country on political leadership, and it represents not nearly so much a failure of economic policy, although that indeed is profound, but a lack of, or an absence of, or a vacuum of political leadership in this country. And it stems from something that Justice Louis Brandeis identified back early in the last century. And he was talking about the concept of liberty. Now, in my view, the primary job of a President of the United States is not to wield the levers of power that are granted to him or her under our laws and under our Constitution. It is not to expand the power of the presidency, which is something that one president after another gleefully has presumed to be the job of the president, the primary job of the president. The job of the president is to protect and defend and expand that thing of value that is entrusted to them, and that is liberty. The job of the president is to protect, defend, and expand liberty, which is the treasure of our very system of government. And yet what we have seen over the last several decades, this is not a problem that sprang forth all of a sudden with the presidency, the swearing in of George W. Bush. It's something that has been building and mounting for many years through successive presidents, Republican and Democrat alike, successive Congresses under both Republican and Democrat leadership. And not only do these so-called leaders not understand what the job and the responsibility of the president is, that is to defend, protect, and expand liberty in America, our very freedom. But as Justice Brandeis indicated, again, in talking about the importance of liberty, he said the greatest dangers to liberty lurk in the machinations, I forget the exact words that he used, of men of zeal who lack understanding. And they don't understand what liberty is. And it is that lack of understanding about liberty and freedom and what our system of government is, and indeed the very role of the president, that is at, I think, the core of why we are seeing these problems and lack of an ability and a willingness to address these problems, not just in the financial arena. We see it in foreign affairs and the failure to understand the problems necessarily inherent in occupying a foreign land, such as Iraq. We see it in the failure of our leaders to address a whole range of problems that are prevalent in our country. And what passes for leadership is simply talking about it in sound bites and then punting the problem for somebody else to address. The problem, as was mentioned in the introduction to our session here today, with regard to the financial crisis, for example, has been well known to folks in Washington who care sufficiently about the problems facing our country to have recognized and understood it. It's been well known to the folks in Washington for almost 10 years now. It was about 10 years ago, I think, maybe 9 years ago, when the New York Times and I think some other media outlets began writing about this new push on the part of congressional leaders and administration, then the Clinton administration, leaders in Washington, to use the mechanisms of power of the federal government. That is, for example, to use the government-supported enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and there are even others of these Macs out there. There's a Farmer Mac out there that I didn't even know about that I was reading about the other day, and Lord knows how many other of these Macs there are lurking out there. But they have control over vast amounts of U.S. taxpayer dollars, either directly or indirectly. And about 10 years ago, both the Congress and, at that time, the Clinton administration decided that it was good public policy to get as many people into houses or into as expensive a house as possible. That would indeed improve the quality of life in our communities, it would reduce crime, it would improve educational standards and all sorts of things, which are not necessarily untrue. I mean, that may very well be true. Home ownership, people enjoying and having a stake, a financial stake of owning a home in a community does indeed demonstrably improve the quality of life. Not alone, it's not the only factor that will, but it is certainly a valid consideration. But to then artificially manipulate the housing market by having the government come in and say, well, we're going to start through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac buying up huge quantities of these mortgage-based securities, or these mortgages, bundling them up into mortgage-based securities, and we're going to purchase these from the lending institutions themselves, the banks that are there in the community, for example, countrywide, one of the largest in the country, but the whole range of banks and financial institutions that we're all familiar with in our communities. The Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, at the behest of the Congress and the administration, was tasked with going out there and essentially just buying up as many of these as they could. Well, that artificially manipulates the housing market, because that then enables the banks themselves that had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac behind them buying up as fast as the banks could write these mortgages. They were buying them up, replenishing the bank's stock of money so they could lend out more, and every time they went through another segment of that cycle, they would be lending out money, mortgages that is, to people who had less and less ability, a decreasing ability to actually meet the terms of those mortgages. And if there were in fact people out there that demonstrably did not have the ability, these financial institutions then were more than willing for the succeeding years, up until the time this bubble began to burst late last year and early this year, they were more than willing to simply come up with very creative ways to enable people, notwithstanding the fact that they couldn't allow these, they couldn't afford these mortgages, to get them anyway. And as we say in Georgia, sooner or later it was going to come a cropper, and the thing was going to fall apart. The house of cards was going to crumble. And again, this was not something that was all of a sudden, or that all of a sudden surprisingly went poof and manifested itself late last year and early this year. It was something that was well known to those in the financial community, and indeed in among the public at large, for those who cared to read about it, since 1999, when these articles first started being written, saying, you know, now wait a minute, this is going to be a problem with these so-called creative mortgage mechanisms that are being developed here, and with the increasing predisposition for these secondary mortgage institutions like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac buying up these mortgages, and then sooner or later the link between the value of those assets, those mortgage-based securities, and the value of the assets themselves, the value of the house, became completely lost. They were turned over so many times, and whether or not, and this is one area where the government really needs to be involved, whether or not there was indeed fraud involved in covering up the lack of proper valuation of those mortgages is something that the government should be looking into, but hasn't. Apparently, at least according to some of the media stories out there over the last few days, sort of in between, you know, the last bailout and the next bailout, There have been some stories about some investigations being launched by the government, the various federal investigative agencies, but they've been fairly late to the equation. Of course, this is one reason why, as we saw in a recent survey by a nonpartisan institute, the Ponemon Institute, every year, for example, they do a survey judging the confidence that the American people have in the integrity, that is the honesty, of all of the various agencies of the government. And very tellingly, in the most recent survey that the Ponemon Institute conducted a few months ago, they determined, this is, I guess, an indication just how bad it is. You know, somebody said the other day, well, Barr, how bad is it? The most trusted agency of the U.S. government is the Postal Service, according to this nonpartisan survey. And what is very serious is the fact that among the least trusted agencies of our government is the Department of Justice. I think they were outranked in terms of being the least trustworthy by the Border Patrol and Customs. But this again is not something that all of a sudden has sprung forward, that, you know, well, we had this great trust in government, and then all of a sudden, when this survey was conducted, something had happened to reduce and diminish our trust in the one agency of the government, that is the Department of Justice, that at least should be viewed with confidence and having the integrity to uphold the laws of this land. This too has been building, this lack of confidence, lack of integrity on the part of our federal institutions has been building for many, many years. And even though the current administration, through the sorry appointment of an experience of Alberto Gonzales as the Attorney General, took that to a demonstrably and obviously new level, that lack of concern, lack of trust, lack of understanding for what the Department of Justice is supposed to do. It's something that had been building gradually over the years because of the misuse of the Department of Justice, the view that has developed among recent presidents that the Department of Justice is not there to assure that our laws and our Constitution are upheld, and that everybody in government, including the President, is held accountable to the Constitution and laws. The view has taken hold, and we see this reflected in the type of people that are appointed to the job of the Attorney General and how the department is manipulated and used to simply provide a vehicle to tell the President what he or she wants to hear to justify whatever it is that they want to do, station troops in this country, ignore habeas corpus, conduct foreign intelligence surveillance without court order on American citizens in their own country, and so forth. The Department of Justice and the job of the Attorney General now, by and large, is viewed as simply an adjunct of the White House. That is, the Attorney General is viewed as the President's lawyer, and the Department of Justice, by and large, as the President's law firm, as opposed to the people's law firm, the one institution that will assure, when all is said and done, that the American people can have confidence in as assuring that the law and the Constitution on which our laws are supposed to be based is upheld. So it is that lack of understanding of the basic institutions of our government, whether it be the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or any of the other departments. It's that lack of understanding and the lack of accountability that has brought us to the sorry state where we have so many leaders and so little leadership in Washington. We have folks in Washington do talk a great game about energy. They talk a great game about educating our children and so forth. Yet who among them has the courage to step forward and say, no, wait a minute. We talk an awful lot and we spend an awful lot of money, about $60 billion a year, on a Department of Education. And we spend somewhat less than that, but still a not insignificant amount of money on a Department of Energy, about $25 billion. And yet, neither of those departments, which are the two most recently created federal departments, both of them have failed absolutely to meet their mandate. The Department of Education was formed back in, I think it was 1977 or so, with the express purpose of improving the education performance and standards of the nation's school children. Now, leaving aside for a moment whether or not that's a legitimate function of the federal government. Parenthetically, it isn't. Leaving that aside, should it not be an important and relevant question for a current or a prospective president or vice president of the United States to be able to justify why we should continue spending $60 billion a year in direct expenditures on the U.S. Department of Education that has absolutely failed to meet the most basic elements of its mandate to improve the educational standards of our children. We have a Department of Justice. Everybody loves to talk about energy. Yet, not one of these candidates has questioned why we have this Department of Energy. The Department of Energy was formed explicitly back in the late 1970s for the purpose of, you guessed it, reducing America's dependence on foreign sources of petroleum. Not only are we now, 30 years later, and many hundreds of billions of dollars more in the hole as a result of funding for this Department of Energy, not only have we not improved on the percentage, about 30% I think it was, back in the late 1970s of our petroleum needs that were being met by imports, but we have backslid tremendously. I mean, the point is, we have these agencies of the federal government expending huge quantities of involuntarily taken taxpayer resources, and they, year after year, fiscal year after fiscal year, cycle after cycle, administration after administration, failed to meet even the most rudimentary criteria that would indicate they're succeeding at anything they're supposed to be doing. And yet not one of our candidates for these major parties ever questions why we have these departments and offices and agencies of the federal government. And should we not, is it not an absolute obligation on the part of our public officials to go back and question these things, ask about them, and say, you know, maybe we don't need a Department of Education in the sense that we now have one. Maybe we don't need a Department of Energy because, for one thing, they're failing to meet the entire fundamental purpose of why they were created in the first place. Doesn't that bother the American people? Shouldn't that bother us? And after all, if we invest in a corporation and year after year, its board of directors and corporate officers not only fail to meet expectations laid out in the minutes of the board of directors meetings or in the bylaws of the corporation, for example, but actually and demonstrably and significantly backslide, I mean, would not, and as an investor or as a member of that company, would not we legitimately say, what in the heck is going on here? You know, kick these folks out of there and let's put some new folks in that will actually make an effort to meet the criteria for success that has been laid out for them and for which they are responsible for using our money. Yet the criteria that we have and that we maintain for running a company is apparently a very different standard from that we use for evaluating government. It's not whether government is succeeding at what it's doing. It's not even whether government is not failing to do even worse year to year than it is supposed to do. It's, well, we need to protect these institutions because, perhaps it's because they sound good. It sounds good to have a Department of Education. It sounds responsible to have a Department of Energy. And it certainly sounds responsible to have all of these regulatory agencies, yet if they're not doing their job, it actually would make more sense not to have them than to have them and give the facade that they're actually doing something, which disguises the fact that these corporations are not abiding by the law, for example, than to have them in the first place. Yet these questions are not being asked, and it's either because there is an utter complete lack of understanding, as Justice Brandeis said, is the root cause of the danger to liberty in America, or they understand it, they see what's written before them. I mean, they read this stuff also, one can presume, these so-called leaders do, but they choose to ignore it. For example, we have a president who seems, if not intent on military action against Iran, certainly predisposed in that direction. Yet, the most recent national intelligence estimate on Iran, which came out, I think, just last year in the National Intelligence Estimate, or the NIE, is the premier intelligence analysis, that is the concerned and concerted judgment of all of our foreign intelligence agencies. The most recent NIE on Iran indicated very clearly, if I'm not mistaken, I've not seen it, but read about it, as probably a number of us have, indicated that Iran is not pursuing a course of obtaining military nuclear capability. Now, that being the case, and we have an administration that is pursuing a policy based on Iran seeking to acquire, if not imminently poised to acquire, that military nuclear capability, and we have a national intelligence estimate that says, no, they're not, then one of two things is the case. Either the administration just is ignoring it, and that would be useful for us to know as citizens. Why are you ignoring the sound judgment of your own intelligence agencies? Or those intelligence agencies don't know what they're doing, or are reaching inappropriate, false, unsubstantiated results. In which case, it would be interesting for us to find out from the President. You have intelligence agencies, and we're spending billions of dollars, and they're entirely concluded within their comfort zone. The whole process is designed not to be able to evaluate, as Martin Luther King, the real measure of these men and women, that is in times of challenge and controversy and under circumstances that they are not controlling, but factors outside are controlling, which is the reality in which a president and a vice president of the United States must operate. And we pay the price. It isn't up to our great crop of leaders to exert leadership. It's up to us to demand that they do that, and to demand that those questions be had, to demand that they operate outside their comfort zone, to demand that they prove to us that they understand what liberty is about and what freedom is about, to show us that they are not predisposed to use the job of the presidency as one after another of their predecessors, will have done, to simply increase the power of the presidency, but rather the opposite, to increase the power of the people and to decrease the power of the government. And in those areas in which government is properly, under the Constitution, empowered to exert influence over aspects of our economy and our infrastructure and our national defense, that it is doing so in ways that actually further rather than impede true advancement and progress. That is what we in the Libertarian Party are trying to do. Criticize us, as you rightly can, for not consistently have done that in a way that makes sense to and is understandable to the American people, the American electorate over the years. But the modern Libertarian Party, the Libertarian Party that I joined formally about 2.5 years ago, is not your grandfather's Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party of 2008 is a party that truly does understand the depth of the problems that face America, that truly understands the fact that government, in its expenditure of money and its wielding of power, has become way too big, far too big, in order to meet even the broadest interpretation of what our founding father envisioned as the role of the federal government. We understand that we're not going to be able to wave a magic wand, because there is not one out there that will immediately change our system of taxation, for example, or the way federal appropriations are had, or the way national defense has given way to national proactive interference in foreign affairs. So we can't wave a magic wand and just do away with all of these very problematic institutions. But it is absolutely essential, as we understand, and as I think in their heart the American people understand, it is vital to begin that process. And it begins with true leadership, and that is based on understanding and being able to think about and take the time to really consider these issues. They're not easy. I mean, these are very, very complex issues. And neither of the other two parties, whether it's in the environmental arena, the economic, financial arena, national defense, civil liberties, and the power of the government to spy on its own citizen without court order, a power which it should not have, but which now it has in a demonstrably increased way. as a result of legislation passed just a few months ago with the support of both of the other presidential candidates, Senators Obama and McCain, that these issues need to be addressed because they're at the heart of freedom and liberty in America, and that is the job of the president. And those decisions are not going to be made within one's comfort zone. They're going to be made outside of one's comfort zone, as fundamental issues of liberty and freedom have been made since before our country was formed, and certainly in the years in which it was formed. And those times under President Lincoln, for example, and if you think back to some of the great leaders of our country, even in the 1960s and 1980s with Kennedy and Reagan and so forth, we have indeed had leaders who have understood that. We don't now. Those that are wielding the levers of power in Washington now don't understand that. They have no business being there, and yet they are there because both the mechanism of perpetuating themselves in power has been allowed to stand, and we the people have not stood up and demanded the real change that we need to reassert and reinvigorate freedom and liberty in America. We in the Libertarian Party believe most deeply in that. We believe that the American people in their heart understand that, and we are going to redouble, not just this election cycle, but every one from now on, redouble our effort to make sure that the American people understand that the Libertarian philosophy and the Libertarian Party, despite they may not agree with every one of its tenets, I don't think you can have a legitimate, viable political party in which everybody agrees on everything anyway, and I'm not sure you'd want that. But to make sure that the American people understand that the issues that the Libertarian Party deals with, the issues of fundamental liberty and freedom, reducing the size, the scope, the cost, the power, and the cost of the government, is a mainstream philosophy, and it's very real and it's very relevant to the American people. We're going to keep doing that, and we hope that you will help us in that, because all of us benefit when freedom is advocated by any one of us. So thank you for having me here this evening, and I'd be glad to answer some questions in whatever time we have allocated. How much time do we have? Very general, in a very specific sense, they certainly should be held accountable for whatever they're doing. They're dealing with other people's money. They certainly should be held accountable. Whether or not there have been criminal laws violated, which I suspect very clearly there have been, we don't know yet, because there have not been any comprehensive investigations, at least that we have been made aware of publicly. I believe that it may very well be the case, for example, if in fact, take the case of a former CEO of Fannie Mae who left office in, I think, 2004 with a fairly substantial golden parachute, and yet who very clearly, according to news articles, had been manipulating, that is, cooking the books of Fannie Mae to make it appear that its assets were far stronger and more significant than they were. If in fact that occurred, or if that has occurred with regard to these other institutions, whether they be investment houses or banks themselves, or the GSEs, the government-sponsored enterprises of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and former Mac and whoever else Mac there is out there, if in fact they were committing a fraud that is misrepresenting either to federal regulators or to their investors, their shareholders, for example, the value of assets, inflating those, or in deflating the value of their outstanding loans, for example, that could very well be, and probably would be, a fraud for which they ought to be held accountable and criminally prosecuted for transportation, certainly, and in large measure for electricity, although we are developing, have the capacity to develop both nuclear and natural gas plants to increase the capacity of electricity production. But the fact of the matter is that petroleum has become the energy source of choice for well over 100 years now, going on about 120 years at least, for a very good reason. It wasn't because it's utterly irresponsible not to do so. That means to free up from some of the environmental constraints, the companies to begin extracting the huge reserves that we know are there of oil shale in the Mountain West states, to begin extracting the lesser known reserves, but still significant reserves in Alaska, and the significant reserves offshore in the Outer Continental Shelf. But I also believe that it would be irresponsible to simply then walk away and say, well, we've taken care of our energy needs. We have to be developing alternative sources. That is, though, the primary responsibility of the free market. While I commend, as I have publicly, former Vice President Gore for his interest and very, very deep commitment to global warming, for example, and the fact of the matter is, I believe beyond refute, that there is global warming. What we don't know is why there is global warming, the correlation between certain factors and global warming. And until we know that, we don't at this point, we can't properly or responsibly be developing technology, for example, and taking policy steps to correct it. But it is responsible to begin to seriously try and understand that. And I do not subscribe to the notion that the primary responsibility, the primary mechanism through which we're going to develop those alternative sources of energy, including those that might not be carbon-based, which the Vice President asserts is the cause of global warming, and that may or may not be the case. His view is that these mechanisms and these steps are going to be taxpayer-funded, government-mandated taxpayer-funded. I disagree with that. The primary responsibility and the primary mechanism should be the marketplace to begin developing those sources of energy that make sense. The development, for example, the extraction of the oil shale, which, I mean, the oil shale reserves in the Mountain West states we've known are there for over 100 years. But it is not and has not been until this point in time economically feasible to develop them. Now it has reached the point where it is. We ought to encourage that, not stand there waving in, well in excess of a $400 billion current year deficit next year, and all of these are even pre-bailout. I don't buy into this notion that all of a sudden these bailouts are going to result in a huge net increase in money coming into the government. I think that's nonsense. Next year we're going to have well in excess of a $500 billion deficit, probably much more than that. Our national debt, which started out this last fiscal year, I think under $9 trillion, which is way too much. Now we're up to $10 trillion, and the debt ceiling is 11.3, I think. That madness has got to stop. We're not going to be able to do any of these other things that we need to be doing, such as reforming our tax system and getting away from the overly complex, oppressive, and from a constitutional standpoint, the 16th Amendment notwithstanding, constitutionally questionable form of funding government. We're not even going to be able to really address that and go to a system of a type of a consumption tax, for example, unless we first get a handle on asset forfeiture provisions that have been abused over the years. But I think what really has made the difference and opened my eyes to become basically in accord with the libertarian position. Now, some libertarians believe in going further than I would. I believe that certainly as a candidate for president and looking at national policy, which is my focus right now, what we ought to be doing is getting the government out of the drug war, leave that as a decision for the people of the states to decide. What really made the difference is the tremendous increase in government power since 9/11. It has so constricted our sphere of personal liberty, our privacy, for example, as Ayn Rand correctly identified. You take away a man's privacy, you gain the power to control him absolutely. So as our sphere of privacy has been dramatically diminished and constricted since 9/11, that means government control has been expanded dramatically consistent with that. I've become much more attuned to the need to not be accepting of allowing the government to get involved in some of these other areas, such as the drug war, that I might have previously been predisposed to say, okay, they can do that because we still have enough freedom left. We don't. And it's caused me to go back and take a very much harder look at what power we have ceded to the government and not be accepting of allowing them to involve themselves in a lot of areas where they used to be. That's probably the main area where I've clearly come over to the libertarian side. 2009 would be to order an immediate 10% cut in the executive office of the president to demonstrate both to the people and to the Congress, and then I would immediately go up to the Congress and challenge congressional leaders to do the exact same thing, to at least set a marker on the table that we're serious about reducing the size and the cost of the federal and demand that our military leaders provide me immediately with a specific plan, a very detailed plan to begin withdrawing our troops, our military security blanket that has propped up the government in Iraq for far too long. And the State Department would be an important part of that, because I would want them to present me with an immediate substantive plan with a very short timetable to reduce the economic security blanket that is being used to artificially prop up the government in Iraq. And thirdly, I would send two messages to the Congress. One, on the first day in office. One would be to tell them that no piece of legislation that purports to raise the national debt ceiling would be signed by President Barr, and no appropriation bill that purports to spend a single dollar more than was spent in the previous fiscal year would be signed, and that would be the ceiling, not the floor. We would then begin, that would be the floor, not the ceiling, we would then begin to build beyond that. In the short term, one of the things that I have called for, and we laid this out if you go to our website, bobbar2008.com, would be to establish a commission on wasteful government, not waste in government, but wasteful government, to, over the course of probably a year or so, would identify every agency, department, and office of the government and justify, rank them according to three criteria. One, is there a constitutional basis for that agency, office, department, or program of the government? Two, if there is it the most appropriate form, level of government, that is the federal government, to carry that out? And thirdly, if it meets the first two criteria, what is do the benefits outweigh the cost? That would provide us a blueprint of every agency, department, office, and program of the government, similar to the Grace Commission back in 1982, but far beyond that, to then go to the American people with a very well thought out list to show them these functions, these offices are not serving you in your best interest. They're not constitutionally based. These are not functions that the federal government ought to be performed, and we're not reaching, and we're not even close in many of these instances to the benefits outweighing the cost.
National debt, the trillions we're starting to spend on the bailout, and the trillions we spend on war and foreign military, overseas military bases. Do you see our interventionist foreign policy as being sustainable over, say, the next 4 to 8 years? And if it's not sustainable, what do you foresee happening under a McCain or Bush presidency, McCain or Obama presidency, and what would you do as president?
Well, it's neither sustainable nor necessary. What I believe we need to be doing is putting the emphasis on our national defense policy on defense. Now, that does not mean we don't need a military. We need a military. It is absolutely essential responsibility of the government to protect the national sovereignty, to protect our borders, and to protect our true interests at home and abroad. If, in fact, a foreign nation or a non-governmental actor takes violent action against us or is poised to, we have a responsibility and a right to neutralize those actions and to take out those responsible. We need a military in order to do that. We don't need a military that is the size of our current military. I believe in quality, not quantity. And there is no justification for maintaining the troop levels and the presence that we have in well over 700 installations in over 135, I believe, countries around the world. That is absolutely unnecessary. The Germans are more than capable financially and militarily of protecting themselves. The Japanese are, the Koreans are as well. We need to dramatically scale those back. It's not isolationist. It is a realistic national defense policy. And I do not subscribe to this notion that, well, such as Senator Obama apparently believes, well, we can draw down the troops in Iraq and we'll just ship them over to Afghanistan. What we need are much more clearly focused and intelligently crafted defense policies and activities, not simply throwing a bunch of U.S. troops into Afghanistan or Iraq or Fredonia or whatever the next crisis might be, to basically simply prop up the government. That's not good national defense.